Hi, my name is James Rozak. I am the creator of the website Morning Mercy, and this podcast is dedicated to supporting those people who are on a journey of walking away from the teaching of William Branham. Some of you may have recently left, some of you may have left a long time ago and are trying to make sense of the past. And whoever you are, wherever you're from, I welcome you to this podcast, and I hope that I could share something of value to you and the life that you have moving forward. So today I just want to talk very casually, and that's kind of the goal over the next while is to speak very casually about various things that I've experienced. I think I'd like to get into sharing a little bit about my own personal story. There's some lessons in there I think that I've learned and maybe would be useful to some of you as well. I also realized that it's been almost 11 years that I have left. It was probably at this time 11 years ago where I was in my last few sermons or services. At this point, I had already told my pastor that I was going to be leaving. There was a lot of tension in the church at the time. Of course, I was an associate pastor of the church. It was a messy, emotional time. And, it's been a long time. And so I recognize I was talking to a friend recently who also left around the same time that I did. And we were just saying, the stories that I would have, the experience that I had might feel a lot different or be a little different than somebody today. And that could just be the environment of the churches, the environment of the world that we're living in around us. It might be a little different. And so my viewpoint and some of the perspectives I had might even feel a little outdated. I'm not even sure. But I guess that's actually the subject that I'd like to talk about today. It's the experience of leaving. I think it's important to recognize and acknowledge that it is going to be very unique to each individual. We come from, when we're in the message, in any kind of fundamentalist group, we come from a very singular view and experience in life. And that is to be part of a group like we were. Part of the teaching, part of the entire mechanism of being in the church is to lose your sense of individuality so that you can adopt the mindset, the oneness of the group. It's in the idea that to be part of the one body, even though we're many members of the body, we have to have one mind to be in Christ, as Christ was taught to us. And so when our pastor is a representation of Christ in the form of his headship, and we're part of a teaching from a prophet such as William Branham claimed to be, and he had a very strong view on the way the world was, on the way we should be within the world and how we should be within the church. It's a very singular, one mind view. And so really every member of the church becomes a representation of the group that you're a part of. And it's a very singular view on everything. I know the message used to claim, or the church, again, this is me speaking from my view of our church. We always spoke as though we were this outward reaching, going into the world and going to spread the message to the church, to the churches that were out there, like the denominations. And maybe that's the way it even felt when I first came into the message. We had a message to share, and we needed to go out and find the lost seed, the last seed, so that we could go into a rapture. So we spoke as though we were outward focused, but the reality was we were so entirely inward focused. We were so fixated on ourselves that we locked out the world, and that was the mission, to shut the world out so that we could take care of our own and solidify our own and protect our own, we couldn't help but have a very isolated view of ourselves and everything outside of us. So then that only makes sense, is that when you're leaving a group like that, it's hard to break out of the idea that we are individuals, especially somebody who was raised in the message. The sense of individuality is something you really haven't experienced. For myself, I was raised in a message family. From the time I was born, I was surrounded by message culture, message teaching, message parenting. There was a phase when my parents left the message, and so I spent a lot of time in my teenage years and whatnot, early adulthood, where I was in the world, so to speak. And so that was one of the reasons I came back to the message, is because I didn't know how to function as an individual. I felt like my individuality was a reason why I was so afraid. Because when you're raised with a very strict view of how you're supposed to behave, and the world around you is like encouraging you to be yourself or to experience life, then it feels hostile and scary to step out, because you feel like you're facing or you're making decisions that could result in death, so to speak. Like, I'm going to get in trouble for doing something that opposes the singular view of my parents. Or even though I was no longer part of a church, it felt like I was betraying the trust or the good graces of my family, and I'm going to be discovered and I'm going to be in trouble. And so I needed to be surrounded by the safety of singularity, of not being individual, of being nestled and nested in the whole of a community where I didn't have to be myself. I just had to adopt the view of a greater community, and I would be more protected. I did want to lose myself. I didn't want to be who I was, because I felt like it was wrong to be me. And so leaving that and going into the world, especially if you've never experienced individuality, you find yourself trying to figure out, like, who am I and how do I behave? And how do I be anything other than what the group wanted me to be? It is a little perplexing and a little bit scary. And then when you come out of the message and you're in a community of ex-message believers, because by virtue of leaving, we find ourselves wanting to belong to something, and the closest, nearest, safest thing for many of us is to find somebody who was an ex-believer and to kind of nestle into them, to, because they understand you and you feel like you'll understand them. And it can also be a little shocking to find out that in the group of ex-message believers, there's not a singular view on what you need to do. And you're almost expecting, like, they're going to have the answers. They're going to be able to tell me where to go and, what church I should go to and what's the next step. And you're going to find there's a lot of opinions on that. And a lot of the reason why is because even in the message, we had very different experiences from one church to the next. When I speak about my message experience, it sounds a lot different than a lot of the other people that I've talked to. In fact, my experience is sometimes wildly different than even the people that I went to church with in my own church. And when they leave and we speak about how we felt, because it's the first time you can really talk about how I felt and my experience and what happened to me. You can't even talk about those feelings and experiences when you're in the message, because you have to present yourself That's just a part of being in the message, is you cannot be vulnerable or authentic. You can't speak disparagingly of the church that you belong to. And if you have a bad experience, it's almost like you have to put on this facade of everything is okay, everything was okay. And then you find out later that it wasn't. And then you find out what was happening in their life. And my experience was different than their experience. And then you go across the city to the other churches in our own city. And the whole reason we were fractured and didn't have fellowship with each other was because their pastor didn't get along with our pastor. And they believed in a very legalistic view, more so than ours. And so the experience of them growing up in that church and living life in that church, it was very different than my view. I'm just saying that when you leave, you're going to find that there's a lot of different stories and experiences. And the way it looks for somebody leaving is going to be different for each person. So don't expect to come out and feel as though there's going to be some sweet harmony between everybody who's left. Some people are going to be very, very angry and hostile. Some of the women that I've talked to who've left, they feel, and it makes sense to me, and I have a great amount of understanding why there's such anger, is because they were so badly abused by, say, a husband, a father, a pastor, and they recognize the misogyny that they experienced, and they're very angry about it. I can understand that. I don't harbor an anger like they do in some cases. I'm angry about other things maybe. But the emotional fallout will be unique and will be different for each individual. And so some people are going to want to run 1,000 miles away from religion, period. And that's their story, and that will always be their story because they're so adverse, for good reason, for the abuse that they suffered. And I know the word abuse is strong, and some people who are in the message who might listen to this episode, they might think, what are you talking about abuse? Well, again, you might feel in your church that it's a very loving and sweet and kind community. But there are some people who have extraordinary stories that typify the church that they belong to. There's probably people sitting in your church. This is something I learned near the end of my time in the church that I went to, who I thought was this, a very healthy environment, even, I'm going to say. I felt we had a very balanced view on William Branham's teachings, and come to find out that there were people that I went to church with all the time that were suffering trauma and a great deal of pain from things that our pastor did, from things that their family was told that they should do in raising their own children. The variables, the stories that you begin to hear in the aftermath, it makes you really understand with wide eyes that it's going to be a very painful journey to leave, to make sense of your own self, your own experience, and hear the experiences that other people had, and to really grapple with the fact that you didn't see it while you were there. And for myself, even, I didn't feel like, for the great many years that I was there, I didn't feel like I was being abused. And then I began to understand later that, wow, I was subject to a great amount of abuse. I just didn't perceive it as that. And so the things that I had to grapple with in the aftermath, or my own wife, or, the people around me, you had to have a lot of grace for it and a lot of patience. And I think that's a difficult thing for people leaving the message to first experience. So that I'm just saying this it's an awareness and a recognition that there's not a path to follow. There's not everybody lining up and going down this singular path towards their healing and the future. You're going to see from the point of leaving. I have this way of saying it, and you're probably going to hear me say this in the next while, over and over in different ways. It's I call it from where you're standing, because from where you're standing, especially when you take the first footstep out of your message church, the place that you plant your foot, where you're standing in that moment, is going to be different than the next person, and then the next person, and the next person. And you might find that you are standing a million miles apart in a lot of ways. The first footstep out from where you're standing, you have to recognize that the way that you view yourself, your church, the message, William Branham, Christianity, religion, it's going to be very affected and characterized by the experience that you had, which was unique. And then the other person, from where they're standing, is going to be a very different story. So recognize from where I'm standing and from where they're standing, it's going to be really different. And the journey from there is, of course, going to be a different path. We're not going to be stepping out onto the same spot and all of us going on this path away. From where you're standing, it doesn't have to look like that person or that person or that other person. It's going to look exactly like what it's going to be for you. And your story is going to be your story. And you're going to have to understand that it's going to be different because we're individuals. And individuality is allowed when you step out of the church. Individuality is not allowed within the church, not to any major degree. Sure, there'll be a little differences between the personalities, and you're going to always see a little bit of character in the individuals because you can't completely uniform us all together. But in the church, we conform and we become uniform because that's the requirement of being in the message. So, yeah, the idea of leaving and having a unique experience shouldn't be shocking. And don't be afraid of it. You worry about you. You make decisions that are good for you. And you don't be afraid to listen and understand and open yourselves to hearing the stories of other people. I had somebody recently who reached out to me because, they knew that I was a former pastor and they wanted to get my advice about, what they should do in the first steps. And so I told them a little bit about where I am today, from where I'm standing, where I ended up. And I told them a little bit about the first decisions that I made when I left. And I wanted to do that because I wanted them to understand that I had a journey, and I'm going to answer you as best I can from my view and my experience. But I can't tell you what you need to do, and I can't tell you what decision you need to make. Is because you need to decide that for yourself, because you're going to have your own perspective and your own view and your own experience to contend with. And it is not my job or responsibility, or it's not good for you, for me to come out and now dictate for you the way and the solution and what it's going to look like. Because no, my experience was mine, and it was very based on where I was starting from. And they're starting from a whole different place, and you're an individual to yourself. So here's what I know, and here's what I've learned. And look, there's somebody over there who's in a similar position as you. You might want to talk to them. And also so-and-so over there. And ultimately, you have to understand that the journey is going to be yours. And you need to find that. And you're okay to take a footstep in the wrong direction and then come back and take a different footstep in a different direction, because you might find it didn't feel good going that way, and that's up to you to figure out, but don't be afraid to take those footsteps. Don't feel like you have to follow anybody. These are things that we learn and we begin to adopt in our own life. And it's good to know this right from the start. Because no, there's not a gathering place for ex-message believers where we all are holding hands and singing songs and everything's okay. It's just the way it's going to go. And it is going to be, in my mind, a harder road than the comfort of staying in the message. And that's one reason why that's another barrier of exit. It's a lot safer to stay in the church community, even if you see problems and even if you believe maybe that the message isn't exactly what we've been told the message is yet. Like, I can see the problems and I recognize that maybe the prophet was more flawed than I could ever imagine. But it's safer to stay than to go out into the wild, wild wilderness and maybe not end up in this perfect holy land that I was promised in the message. So I'm just going to choose to say to stay safe in the message. I've heard pretty much verbatim people tell me that. It's like, I would leave, but I'm not sure what I'm going to experience out there. And it scares me. And I don't know what's going to end up with my family. And I don't want to end up in a bad place. So rather than take the chance, I'm going to stay and abide the problems in the message because it's almost the end time and I want to feel safe. And fair enough. That's a decision that everybody can make. And I'm not going to grab onto somebody and throw a lasso over them and drag them out. Because no, I'm an individual and you're an individual. And I respect that you feel that way. And okay, if you want to stay, you can stay. As for me, I jumped out into the wild, wild west. And I ran through the wilderness. And you know what? Here I am all these years later, and a lot of people would look at me and think his life fell apart. And for me, I would say it was the best thing that I've ever done in my life, and I wish I would have done it way sooner. And that's my story. So there's no conclusion to what I'm saying here. And I think that's kind of really the point that I'm making. There's no nice tidy bow that I can wrap around what I'm saying. It's a journey you just take. And it's something that you risk. And when you go, you're going to have a story to tell, just like I have a story to tell. And your story is going to be a whole lot different than mine. Maybe there'll be similar things. But I think there's value in understanding this because I could look at somebody else and I don't have to, how do I say this? I've met for coffee many people who've left the message over the years. And I don't have to sit here as a judge of what they decided to do with their life. And I don't have to be a critic. And I don't have to preach to them what I think they should have done and the mistakes that I think they made. No, I recognize the difficulty of the journey on leaving, and I recognize and respect and value the individuality that they have and the freedom that they have. I think that's one of the greatest things that I've really understood in the aftermath is the essence and the value of freedom and respecting the individual. That includes people who decide to stay and people who leave and they take a whole different life path than the one that I took. But I could sit with them and I don't have to be a judge. I can be their friend and I can show kindness to anybody, no matter what path they're on. And because I like to be afforded that same level of respect and kindness as well. It's a change of worldview to look and value individuals and individual people for who they are and respect the autonomy and the sovereignty of their own life and not feel like I have to like judge and dismiss people because they're different than me. That's one of the great gifts that I've been given in leaving the message. So I'm going to end off there. I don't know if I rambled, but this is kind of where I'm going to go over the next while. I just want to talk. I just want to talk about things that I've learned in the aftermath of leaving. This topic, that topic, another topic. If you want to leave a comment below and have me just ramble about something that I've gone through and my opinion on anything, by all means, put it in the comments and I'm willing to talk. And again, I'm not talking from the point of view that you have to agree with me or anything close to that. I'm just saying, I think it helps to hear stories of people just talking the way that I'm talking, so that it takes away some of the boogeymen and scary things that you might perceive about people who've left. It humanizes the event of leaving the message. And here I am 11 years later and living life and experiencing ups and downs and ins and outs, and that's the way it goes. So thank you for listening. Again, my name is James. I think the next times I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey through the message and what that was for me as an individual. Maybe you can relate to some things, and I'm just sharing. That's all I'm doing. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in a different episode.